Always.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and today I'm here with Arthur Clarke. Thanks for joining me, Arthur, for this discussion.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, let me give a little bit of a background that you're Emeritus Professor at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, and you're a professor of and coordinator of the Counseling and Human Development Program, and a very prolific author. I think 5 books or so, and 2 of them are right here. Let me get them up. One is this is an older one from 2007, Empathy in Counseling and Psychotherapy Practice. It's Perspectives and Practice. And this one is just out, I believe, Empathy and Mental Health. And that's an integral model for developing therapeutic skills in counseling and psychotherapy. So really a pleasure to be able to talk to you, because you've thought a lot about empathy as well as early memories. Is there more you'd like to say, just by way of introduction, about yourself?
I now live on Cape Cod in Massachusetts and get to go swimming most days in a great summer. So things are going very well in my life. And I do spend time with empathy. One thing with empathy, if you say you know something about it, people expect you to be empathic all the time. So that can be a challenge.
Yeah, and they're always judging you for not being empathic. So you're writing about empathy, but you're not empathic.
I know, what's going on here? Good.
Yeah, great. Well, so you're retired, you're enjoying life and getting out on the water, and you've thought a lot about empathy. You know, having written besides these 2 books, you have numerous papers, as well as I saw numerous articles on Psychology Today about empathy, and so thought we just talk about your interest in empathy, so the model you have of empathy, how that model came about, and kind of go into the a bit into the depths of it. I have my own model too. Maybe at some point we can sort of compare and contrast those, but maybe just start with how you got into creating this model, into the interest in empathy.
Sure. Maybe it'd be good if I start with the 2007 book that has pictures of my children on it when they were young, and my mother-in-law. And at that time, I was interested more from the theoretical point of view, different theories. And Carl Rogers was prominent is prominent in the field. And it seemed as though he had pretty much all that could be said about it. And as I read materials, that seemed to be the case. But then with further readings and investigation, I found there were far more individuals that really deserve credit for giving focus to empathy, particularly in therapeutic contexts and in everyday life. So that featured the text 13 Theories. Well, time went on, read more on empathy and practiced, and I was teaching at the time graduate students. And I thought in teaching, usually there was a skills focus. So I would talk about empathy and its value, and we would all agree it makes sense, it's important. And that was what the literature said. But it seemed as though empathy was focusing on one skill as a counselor or a therapist, which was reflection of feelings. So you might be, say I see your books behind you, and say you lean over and you drop 4 or 5 of them on the floor. You just happen to do that. So I said, oh, that's so upsetting to you. And then you said, and that could be a reflection of feeling. And so the literature too seemed to be limited, not always, but many cases, to that technique of reflection of feeling. But then I read further, as I do, and further experience, knowing that, you know, empathy, if you think what it is, it's, I think, understanding a person or trying to, striving to, and building a relationship. And if you can do that, usually you can interact with them fairly effectively using different things that you may say. As I said to you, you drop the book, but then I know you a little bit and I say, oh, that happens. And I do that too sometimes. And we move on. But so I thought, let's look at techniques that beyond reflection. And that's what the book took me toward. And I ended up with 14 techniques, and I call them stage skills. And then there were 14 strategic skills. So 28 in all are in the book. So that's the new direction for the book.
So what I'm hearing there is Carl Rogers did active listening, empathic listening in the Therapeutic, and you're sort of looking in deeper and you're saying, oh, there's a lot more to empathy than just this active listening.
Yes.
And so do you want to go through some of those? That'd be.
Sure. Okay. Let's say one that comes up called confrontation. And we can do this, talking about this therapeutically, and it also can work in everyday life too. Confrontation is usually you're doing something that's kind of self-defeating, not in your best interest, but you're contradicting yourself. So I'll jump into the book idea.
Okay,
so you say, I've been meaning to clean up those books for a long time now. I got to sort them out. And then you tell me that. And a couple of weeks later, I visit you and you haven't done anything with it. So I say to you, and this is when it's not helpful, Irvin, you haven't done anything, Irvin, with the books. I think that you need to get going on it. Okay.
So you're telling me what to do here
yeah. So that's not empathic. However, an empathic statement, and I'm still trying to understand your frame of reference, I may say, you've been pretty busy recently. You have a lot to do that's quite important. And maybe the books is something to you that's kind of on the back burner. And you'll get to it in time, perhaps in the winter. See the difference between the two. But the first one, I made no effort to understand you.
Yeah, you're just telling me what to do. And the second one, you're sort of putting it in the context, like why I didn't do it, and trying to understand why I didn't do it, sort of the motivation, the reasoning behind it.
The reasoning behind it. So with each skill, and here's the challenge, throughout the therapeutic process, always stay empathic. An attitude, as Rogers talked about. So it doesn't start and then stop. You see, if you begin, you seem empathic and understanding, but then you start changing and you seem to get directive or imposing, demanding, or whatever is the case. You've lost your empathy. I think the point I'm trying to make in the most recent book was you never leave it. Because how could you leave it if you're always trying to understand a person and you're always trying to keep a relationship with them that's positive? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like you don't give a little bit of empathy, then you start directing people or start detaching or doing a whole lot of other things that are not empathic. So I'm hearing there that you just kind of keep an empathic state of being, or which is actually, I'll just plug, the model I'm using for empathy is like you. I'm very influenced by Rogers, building on Rogers' work. He wrote a paper called Empathic and Unappreciated Way of Being, which I think is one of his really just excellent papers. And it's that way of being. So I even take it a little bit farther and say that as a human being, we want to hold and maintain or nurture that empathic way of being, where we're sort of relating empathically to the world on an ongoing basis, and also it being mutual, and then working towards a culture of empathy, which is create a culture that has that empathic way of being. So I think you're kind of moving sort of in that direction by saying it's just not a one-time little bit of empathy here, but that you're kind of expanding the beingness or the ongoing nature of empathy.
Yes, which, and I think you have probably found this too. And this got me really going in terms of trying to understand what empathy is. Reviewing the literature, there is a ton, a proliferation of definitions. There's no consensus.
Mm-hmm.
And you can ask anyone what it is, and you'll get a different answer. So that becomes a problem,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
particularly if you're trying to say how to do it. Because you could say, well, walk in my person's shoes or pick up on their feelings, but that tends to be vague.
Yeah.
But it's commonly used. So there is little research on what is empathy, but it's emerging, it's developing. So I thought I'd try to come up with a definition. Gave it a lot of thought because you have to go beyond what is fairly narrow and restricted views of the conceptualizing empathy. Rogers helped. He wrote an article in 1964, and it was in a book on behaviors of phenomenology. And so he said this: empathy is interpersonal. You and I are talking now, or it could be a group of people, and we try to understand and appreciate each other, listening and that. So, but that's well known. That's accepted. Most would agree that's what empathy is. However, he also said there's a subjective empathy. Subjective, he talked about in his article, that would be things like a personal taste of food or a view you have of a person, but it's personal. And he felt at the time, and he was consistent through his writings, do not go into the subjective view. Keep yourself out of the equation. Meaning that if you do veer into your own views, they can be biased and narrow, and they can also be outside of they are outside of the client of the person's frame of reference. Okay, he said that. So I thought, I'm not so sure about that, because it seems that I'm not sure how you can keep yourself out of it. For example, when I said you had reached over and knocked over the books, okay, people listening or viewing likely imagine the books toppling down, or they could picture them in their mind. And they can also identify with you. And so knocking the books over, and you talk about the books, you'd say you did it earlier. You have a subjective view. So I can't help but feel along with you and identify with whatever this problem might be. And it could be a joyful experience because I'm human and I connect with that. So the subjective view is new. But I also found in the literature support for this. So that notion then becomes part of the definition of but it's often overlooked.
Mm-hmm. When you're saying, when you're saying subjective, do you mean like you're listening to me, you're, maybe you're doing reflection, or I take an action, you could say, oh, I see you've dropped the book, and maybe you see I'm like frustrated, right? You say, and I'm hearing you're frustrated. Or I could have dropped it and said, yay, great. And you would have been like, oh, I see you dropped the book, and I'm understanding you're joyful about it. So that's the sort of the interpersonal sensing into my experience. Is that?
But it's me.
Mhm.
It's your experience,
Uh-huh.
but I'm feeling it, or I'm identifying with it, or I'm viewing it, picturing it in my mind. This could probably work better if we had a story. We can come to that under early recollections. Well, I think we can review this maybe through one of your early memories. But so I'm listening to you and you're talking about your life. When did you say something to me that
Okay,
what you're doing
like
today
a
or
early
yesterday?
memory, yeah. So
Uh,
sure.
oh,
I remember.
oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know if we should jump into that just yet.
Oh, okay,
You just
whenever you
you
just let me.
tell me something, some thing you happened that was a good deal or not so good, but you have to describe it to me. Let's get away from the books. You just
Mhm.
talk about something. It happened a few days ago, or it could happen in the future, whatever is the case. Something that you can tell me, and it might even be distressing to you, or
Hmm.
it could be something that's a relief for that.
Yeah, so it's something kind of current. Well, I'm growing some tomatoes out in the front yard, and those are the only things I'm really growing. So it's kind of nice to get out of the office, go look at the tomatoes, see if they're ripening, checking them. I put a lot of mulch down so they're well covered, and there's also a lot of compost that I'd put on, gotten some compost from the local community
Mhm,
composting center,
mhm,
and I picked them, and it's a lot of fun to do this, to grow them, but they're not the best tasting tomatoes. And yeah, and I did plant them a little late, so it's a little bit late, and that they're kind of ripening kind of late in the
mhm.
season. But anyway, I just like going out, watering them, something just to get me out of the house a little bit, to have some kind of an activity to do. So I enjoy that.
That's just right. So what I'll do is talk about my experience, but this would be for someone, not just me, anyone viewing this. And this is the subjective. Now, I'm not just listening to your words, I'm feeling it. So when you said you planted the tomatoes, I pictured you on your knees digging a hole and putting these little plants in. Then I pictured you with some mulch around it here and that, and I could identify with that. I did that a few years ago myself.
Hmm.
I don't have to fully identify, but momentarily identify with that. And I didn't have very much success either. They didn't come out at all, in fact. But then when you talked about the taste, I
Yep, your video's frozen. Recording. So we just had a little technical glitch, and you
yeah,
were just sharing your experience with planting,
yes,
the imagining me planting, and then remembering your experience of your tomatoes not working out so
right.
well too. It was the last thing I heard.
That's that's right. And so then I could taste a little bit, and it almost tasted a little acidity. It wasn't as sweet as I felt, um, but I had that was all within me. Almost an intuitive sense too that it's going to be okay. The tone you had with your discussion, that it wasn't going to be catastrophic, and as it turned out, but you did well with it. That would be an example of subjective. And if a person can be okay and think about, you can imagine the story. You can't help yourself but imagining it when a person describes it. But typically what happens, you use your head. You just kind of listen to the words. Instead, there's this resource that we have subjectively if we are receptive to allowing it to kind of resonate within ourselves. And so unleash your kind of imagination or your identification or sometimes you can feel it. I can have a embodied sense within me what it's like, particularly if it's profound in some way. It uses in that. So that's a subjective view.
Okay, well, let me reflect that.
Yes.
So I could be, sharing the stories of the tomatoes, planting them,
Right.
and you could be doing reflective listening, just reflecting what you're hearing me say. But there's another component of what's going on in you while you're doing the listening,
That's
and you're
right.
being impacted by that. You're imagining you had planted tomatoes before.
Right.
You were sort of identifying with it. You could sort of feel the different aspects. Your whole body is sort of involved in the imagination and the listening of that. And you're calling that subjective of the person. What's going on in them is the subjective quality. But if you were listening to me, like I shared about my tomatoes, and then instead of saying, "Oh, I hear you," planted these tomatoes, you're feeling a little frustrated, maybe that they're not growing as well as you want, but you're sort of satisfied. It's okay. You're enjoying the process of dealing with plants. And so that would have been staying present with me and listening to me. And you could be having all those subjective thoughts going on behind the scene. But if you were to say, you're listening to me, but you were to say, "Oh, that reminds me of when I planted tomatoes, and then the tomatoes didn't work out very well," and that kind of stuff. So that you're experiencing, having those experiencing, but it's not like you're sharing them back with in that case necessarily.
It is and it isn't, because there's an objective empathy we'll talk about in a bit. But so for now, no. I want to hear your story. I don't want to tell you about, oh, it did occur to me. It can't help it that I had my tomatoes, but not now, not before we listen to your story. And typically that can happen with the empathy that a person brings their own material in. Oh, that happened to me too. Sometimes even before you finish your story about the tomatoes, all of a sudden, and then they talk about their tomatoes for 10 minutes, sort of losing you. So to stay with the person for that period of time, you're honoring them in a way, but you're also resonating. And it's much more lively, engaged way to allow empathy to be experienced because I'm with you. In fact, for a period of time, I am you, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I'm right along with your story. But what happens is the people are told, well, be empathic. But that's not enough. You have to know what is the ingredients of empathy or the components. That's why the subjective empathy kind of makes sense. And by the way, this is in a lot of literature too. This model.
It is or is not?
It is.
Oh, it is.
It
Okay.
is. I try to bring that in my new book. So the subjective in that and to support it, because it doesn't do very much good if there's a model out there and there's no literature, the classic literature, current material that is accessible so that others can tune into it or read it or be familiar with it. So that becomes a subjective.
Okay.
Now,
so you're listening to me, but you have this other, feelings, thoughts, imaginations coming up in you while you're listening to me, but you're still staying present with me and continue to listen.
That's right.
With me.
That's right. And the word would be resonating. I'm resonating with you. Now, that may sound, well, that's really hard to do. I have to talk to you and all of this and do all this imagining and identifying. But I don't, I think it kind of happens anyway. You can't help if you're talking about something to imagine it or identify. So, but there's also a training. Say a person doesn't do it as well with that. I think this can be trained. And that again is supported in the literature. Train yourself with imagination, or even allow yourself to know that's what it is. You know, to allow that enrich the person's story through that. So that you have that.
So can I just,
Go
when you're
ahead.
saying where is the imagination? You as the listener in this scenario are the listener, and you're imagining things and you're saying that your imagination could be deepened, and there's skill. It's a training. You could do some
Yes.
training of your imagination to be
Yes.
more imaginative, or
Yes.
uh,
Or even to endorse it as a possibility, because it may not be familiar to a person that's trying to be empathic. That part of that is your imagination, you know, because it's not the connection may not be, they may not be familiar with that. So to allow that and identification. One problem with the identification is, particularly therapeutically, you may over-identify. And so say a person is in therapy, counseling, and they have issues, very difficult, challenging, hardships, and it can become burdensome to an individual, or even further, trauma. So you're trying to be empathic and you identify with their experience that are painful. But if you stay too long with it, excessive identifying, so that it then becomes one of stress and ultimately burnout, because it's too much. You can't leave it. So what is necessary, and here's where Rogers also spoke in the 1964 article, objective empathy. And he said, objective is reputable sources of knowledge. It's a experience that a person has, and they build this up. And it's a way of looking at data and then using it. That's objective, and that's in the scientific community. This is how things are done empirically. Now, at the time, he also said, this is not empathy. Empathy is not being detached and kind of remote and looking at information and data. That's not empathy. And so he rejected it because he said you're objectifying a person when you do this. For example, the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, American Psychiatric Association, big manual in terms of various disorders. He would reject that. He wouldn't make sense of it. All that data, because if you look at it, you're not connecting with a person. If anything, you're building up expectation and a bias toward them to behave in a certain way. And it's a very narrow way of doing that. So, but now here is where I differ from Rogers again. By the way, it's rather humbling to think about differing from Rogers. I always thought that he was the ultimate person to talk about empathy. But you know, it's been many decades that he died in the early 80s. But not only that, he had a point of view that we can build on and we can go and grow from. But the objective empathy is, if you're talking about something on an everyday basis, then I can connect with my experience much the same way of identifying with it, but also through my life experiences. But when you take it into a therapeutic context, there are theories and knowledge that is well substantiated, documented, that I can use to make sense of you, to understand you. For example, defense mechanisms, the, such as denial. Say a person has an issue with substance abuse, and then they deny their misuse or abuse of the drugs. They need to protect themselves. It's threatening to them, so they deny it. I don't do that. It's something I've gotten away from. It's not important to me. But we know that that isn't the case, sadly. On the other hand, a person may say they rationalize. It gives me some relief. It gives me a break. I have a lot of pressures in my life. And then they say, I need to have my whatever means to get high. Okay, but we also know that that is maybe true, plausible, but there's another aspect of it. There's a lot of maybe just problems in the person with the person that they're encountering because of this matter. So if you can understand the defenses, that's objective data, it's in the literature. But rather than just think the person's lying or they're just kind of covering up, that doesn't go very far to understand them. But if you can go to defense mechanisms that have been known for over 100 years and Freud first introduced them, and they have been refined and much study given to them. So that framework can be quite helpful in understanding that person. Why wouldn't you use it? You have it. And so to say objective empathy doesn't fit, that seems to me to be very limiting in terms of understanding the breadth and the scope of empathy, which is really trying to understand the person. If that
Okay, well, let me reflect a little bit on what I'm hearing here. So you actually started with identifying, and so let's say I'm working on, maybe you stay back with the story of the tomatoes. It's an easy one.
All right.
So I'm working on it, and I'm having trouble with the tomatoes. Would identification be like, oh, I remember when I had trouble with the tomatoes too. I know how that feels, the frustration of it. So is that what you're considering to be identification, identifying with me in the?
I think that would be, that's, with that, it'd be more what knowledge I could give you. Well, I say I attended a training session on growing tomatoes, which I hadn't. And then I am able to tell you, you need to fully water the tomatoes. When you put mulch down, that's not a good idea. I inform you, but in a way of putting it in words that are understandable. I know I might say to you, you put down mulch. By the way, I could be way off on this. And I went to a workshop and I found out that's not a good idea. It's best to put down soil, and that then enriches the plants and it makes them more edible or whatever.
But what you're describing, you had started talking about identification, then you went into the objective empathy. So what you're describing now, is that identification, or is it objective empathy? Because you're referencing learnings that you've had about the planting of tomatoes, which would be the objective. I would understand that as the objective empathy. You had some courses, you saw YouTube videos,
right?
You had some formal training about it, some college, they've got the study, they study these things in depth, how tomatoes work and how to propagate them. There's different varieties of tomatoes, and different ones work with different soils. You just know that whole sort of knowledge, academic knowledge, that not even from your own experience, but just that you've learned through reading or trainings or something like that. So that would be the objective empathy, as I understand it, is all those sources of information that are coming into your awareness.
Right.
But the thing I was trying to get to, you'd moved past it pretty quickly, was the identification. So I was trying to just go back to what were you, I was trying to get within that scenario, where's the identification of me with the tomato plants?
I can see that because I'm identifying with your struggle. You're trying to make sense of this, and it hasn't worked out real well. And I'm kind of holding back on my knowledge for a little while. So my identification lasts to a point. Then I shift from it, and I shift into another modality, which is objective, which is data. And then I share that with you. So what is happening here is that there's a movement. I will be in identification, or I may be imagining, I've heard that. It allows it to resonate. I have a pretty good understanding of you. And then I can then switch to another modality, which is objective. And I may think they give you data then, and that will help you because I understand what it is. You're frustrated, but I have something I can offer you, and I want to share this with you. It helps me understand, and then you feel more understood because rather than I just spoke to this guy, it was okay, but it didn't really go anywhere. He gave me some good stuff. He went on YouTube and everything, and that was helpful to me. And you do go away feeling more understood, and I feel I understand you more. And we can then have a discussion on this planting, the little bit that I know and you know. But that's objective. So what I'm saying here is a lot of times with empathy, it's stay in your frame of reference. It's that phenomenological view.
Right.
This brings me in. It's a two-way. It's two parties. Because otherwise, when you think of a human connection, if I just listen to you, then what about me? I have something to offer and say, and let's have a human encounter with my material. But it's always in the service of you. It isn't that I'm still trying to understand you, make things a connection with you. So if I offer this little knowledge of empathy of tomatoes, we're all on the tomatoes, you feel gratified by that.
Yeah, it's like, oh, that's the solution. I'd be if it hits on the mark, right? It could be, oh, I would feel a sense of excitement, right? Like, oh, I might be able to really solve this problem. I'm going to go out there and try this. So, for example,
you could do that. Now, I hope in trying to explain the model, let's say you say to me instead, you sound like you know everything you need to know about tomatoes. And I find that offensive, you say to me. I find it offensive. You shouldn't be telling me what to do. I was enjoying it till I talked to you and listened to you about your internet search. So then I switch to interpersonal empathy.
Okay.
And I say to you that I think I went too far. I think I was pushing my ideas on you, and you don't need this. You don't need a lecture from me. You don't have to listen to that. And I was off base.
Well, that's the thing with there's really subtle things that are going on here, and how to sort of identify those. Because when you're listening to me and I'm talking about the tomatoes, I feel good, I feel understood. I'm sort of exploring that. You might be identifying, saying, "Oh, I had that experience too with my tomatoes," and then you sort of interrupt, so that the flow of my kind of self-exploration. So that would be one way to interrupt. Another way would be to interrupt with, "Hey, I've got all this technical knowledge. Let me just sort of throw that in." So there's a point where it's sort of like appropriate, and maybe not, for holding that sort of empathic presence. There's maybe a presence of empathy, and that you have to sort of read, are you staying within that presence, or are you shutting it down somehow?
That's right.
And so you're saying, and if you sense you're sort of shutting it down, the person starts constricting, you're saying, oh, well, let me step back and just listen some more. And I know it from myself, right? So I have a problem, I'm telling my friend, first thing they jump in is with advice, they know it all, but I'm like totally pissed off because they think, hey, don't you think I've thought of all those things already? The problem is so much deeper, and you're not even listening to get to the deeper aspects of the problem. So,
and you bring up an important point. The objective data is things that I'm thinking about in my mind. I can't help it. Almost once you start talking about tomatoes, start thinking about, I had done the internet search, I went to this training, but keep quiet about that stuff. Hold off on it, and it may fit or may not. But typically what people do is immediately they start talking about their own story. You had an operation. Oh, I had an operation too. And before you finish your story, I'm telling you about my operation. But it's that way. So if anything, objective experience and objective knowledge, wait. Wait until the story has been told and you fully listen to it and you understand it. And like with the tomatoes, and so after 10 minutes, it may or may not be helpful for me to share this. And like that. But therapeutically, it's similar. I have very same thoughts, like for you, say if we could jump back to the substance abuse, so that I'm thinking this person, oh, let's say depression. Okay. So you're talking about a depressive episodes and we first meet. And then I'm listening and I'm thinking objectively, this sounds like it's a milder form of depression that I'm hearing, or it may, on the other hand, be major. But I'm thinking that these are objective thoughts I have in my mind, but I don't share those with you. I listen to your story, and I only perhaps later do I may make reference to the DSM because I'm checking in on a diagnosis, but I don't tell you that. But it informs my way of listening to you, so that if I can get a sense, it's more of a mild type of depression that you're experiencing, then that helps me understand you. But how did I come up with that? I listened to your story, I allowed it to resonate. I interacted with you interpersonally, I talked to you about it. But then I was able to objectively go to a source and get a sense of what does the literature help me with? And that then informs my way of working with you. Let's say I don't do that. I meet you next time and I just decide, well, I'll base it on your story. I haven't had any way to appraise this, to kind of gauge it in terms of other people's experience. But if I look at that literature, the DSM, for example, I can then work more effectively with you. And you're probably going to feel more understood. Let's, for example, I looked at the literature, and it's more dysthymia. It's more of a milder case of depression. Because I look at the indicators, and you've told me this in your story, and I'm kind of reassured with that literature. And then when I meet you, I know that probably the level we need to work at, it will not be extensive. On the other hand, I listen to the story and I hear elements of it that indicate it's a major depression. It's chronic, ingrained. Then when I meet you the next time, I can probably work more effectively with you, knowing it's more extensive, the type of treatment that you would benefit from, you see, based on that. That's objective data. Rogers did not go in that direction.
Yeah.
He didn't like the idea of assessment or appraisal because, again, it veered outside of the client's frame of reference. And that's where the distinction is.
Mhm.
He provided this framework, but he didn't talk about subjective and objective, and we are now doing that.
Yeah, and his approach was, I will just listen to the person, and the solutions will come from the person
Yes.
being heard themselves. So whatever creativity, innovation, problem solving happens, that he would not, he kind of went to maybe something going on, like, oh, I feel a little depressed myself, or feel at some point he as a listener might just share a little bit
Yes.
to let the person know where he was, but not really so much giving suggestions or advice or like that. So that's a little different. Maybe I could.
If I may jump in,
Sure, go ahead.
His work, group work, toward the latter part of his life, he did more of that sharing of his own experience, particularly with intuition, which we haven't talked about much. That's also part of the subjective model too. But you go ahead.
Oh, I was going to just maybe at this point share a little bit of the framework model that I'm using
Yes.
for empathy.
Yeah.
So I don't come from the therapeutic world. I come from just a human being out there, having done a lot of world travel, kind of just relating to people. So I think in terms of empathy more from a cultural, social, interpersonal part, not from that what's happening in the therapeutic world with the client therapist relationship. So the definition I'm building on is empathy as a way of being, which is also Rogers had addressed that it's more a way of being, is more the how you are as a human being, like your sense of your attitudes, your the values you have, the sense of presence, lack of not judging everybody yourself, being a big sort of a block to that. And then within that way of being, there's different facets of that. So there's the other oriented empathy, which is a bit what you're calling the interpersonal, listening to someone, sensing where they are, doing empathic listening, reflective listening. There's self-empathy, which maps a bit to your subjective empathy, which is sensing into your own your own feelings, and what's happening in you. A lot of that could be kind of with Gene Genlin with focusing. There's a lot of tools there for sensing into the feelings of yourself. You're sort of adding identification as well as the objective, when you're sensing into yourself. Then there's imaginative empathy, which is role playing, which I see very distinctive. And I should add too that the framework, I'm not using the client therapist framework, I'm using the empathy circle as the container. So in the empathy circle is what I've really been focusing on. It's using Rogers' active listening, but we have usually 4 people to a circle. One person is the speaker, and they select who's going to be their active listener. They share on the topic of tomatoes or depression or whatever, and that person only reflects back what they're hearing the person say. And we usually have a time limit, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, until they feel heard to their satisfaction. But there is a time limit so that somebody doesn't go on for, dominate the time. But then when that time is up or they feel complete, the listener becomes the speaker, and they select someone in the group to speak to, and that person reflects back what they're hearing the new speaker say in the same way. So, and they get their 5 minutes. So they've been the listener, but then they become the speaker, and then they can say all the things. All the things you're talking about, the subjective, subjective, whatever is coming up in them, they have a shared time to share that on any topic. They can reflect, build on what they just heard, or they can come up with, hey, I got a whole different topic, other thing I want to talk about. It's your time, it's your free speech, and you speak to that person, they listen, they reflect back, and then somebody's kind of keeping time. So the 5 minutes is usually the typical time, and then the time is up, and then that person who is the active listener then becomes a speaker, and we go for 2 hours, like just doing this, and so that's sort of the container. I think that container is more of a container that maps onto life more generally than the client therapist. Like I see, as a listener and listener and active listener and speaker is a bit like the client therapist relationship. But then you've done your listening, but then you get met with empathy yourself. And I think that might be what's missing from I see it as missing from the therapeutic, is that the person is only receiving empathy, working on their problem, versus learning to empathize with others and take those skills out to build a more empathic culture. So I see a lot of overlap with what we're talking about with those two different models.
They're different, but they're similar. Because it's a listening and acknowledging. The person feels understood, and my bet in that 5 minutes, they feel deeply understood. And
they do. They comment on it all the time.
All the time, but they also feel connected with the other people. So if you look at what is empathy, is it one, a feeling understood, being understood, sharing, but also connecting. And there's a third element, and I think you're touching on this too, because then what's the outcome of that? It seems like if that was the case and they felt empathized with, they're going to take that and go into the world with it, because they feel sometimes for the first time what it feels like to be empathized with deeply. And so your model, I think, fits very well with the community that is going to, because it's 5 minutes, it's kind of very clear what is done, but each person is honored, but each person then gets an opportunity to share what it was like to listen to the individual. By the way, where it could be augmented, you could talk about, I imagined that, or I identify with, or I felt it in my body, or I had an intuitive sense when you were talking, it was going to be okay. You can start using some of the terminology to add to your model that we have been talking about. Or the objective, and knowing that the objective can wait. You don't want to impose, but it can also be something that could be heartening or edifying. Why would you hold that back if that helps the person in terms of feeling understood or connected to? So I think there's a compatibility in what we're doing.
Yeah, I see it as well, because you're describing what's going on in the mind and body and experience of the listener, the person who's listening. There's all kinds of stuff going on there. They could even feel, there's maybe even anxiety of, oh, am I listening, doing a good job of listening? There's always kind of self-judgment, or they could even be having judgments like, I really think what this person is saying is pretty ridiculous, doesn't know what he's talking about, or she. And when it's your turn to speak, you're welcome to have the full spectrum. You're welcome to be judgmental. It's like, you're full of shit. Like, well, I hear you say I'm full of shit. And that's sort of the core of mediation too, because if you can bring people into that relationship, of listening to each other, it's like the core of conflict mediation, people working things out. They might start off with judging each other, but as they start feeling heard, they start opening up and they develop that sense of understanding and connection and work through conflicts. I mean, I've used it in political mediation, etc.
You're also, though, because if we limit empathy to the person's frame of reference, the person talking, that then doesn't allow you to give your perspective. All that you bring to it, the human experience you have, it's not seen as that's fair game, because you have to stay within and that's fitting narrow, because we all have our limitations, and it's kind of isolating too. So the full
Okay, what is the
connection,
context? Who doesn't get to speak fully? Who are you saying doesn't get to speak?
you were talking about when you disagreed with someone, and you're talking, you are giving your external frame of reference. You see, and a lot of times that's seen as a no-go with empathy. And I'm making the point, no, you have much to talk about,
Right.
to share. Um, Martin Buber, the philosopher, the existential relation therapist, talked about the I-thou relationship, that I look at you as I, and I honor that, I respect that quality within you. I value you as a person. But then I have thou. I also have my own value. I have my way of being too. And only when we can meet and share is it a full human way of being. And
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of where I'm going with this subjective,
Mm-hmm.
objective,
Mm-hmm.
because that allows that, or it
Yeah.
affirms that as a possibility.
So you're wanting both parties to really share who they
Yes,
are, because
yes.
unless they can both share who they are, you're not going to get to a deeper sense of connection between the two.
No,
And I think I heard there was a discussion between Buber and Rogers,
right,
and Buber basically said, well, with your therapeutic approach, you'll never get to the I thou,
no,
because it's sort of this one-way listening.
right.
And it's also two parts. One is it's one-way listening, and the other, I think, was sort of a client therapist framework instead of
Hmm.
human beings, to human beings. So he saw some limitations, I think, to that.
Yes, it was. There was a disagreement with that, and their dialogue. In fact, who was saying it was limited, but at the same time, the power of what Rogers did, his work, is so important because the interpersonal makes a difference, because that's when it's articulated, then it's voiced. It has to be expressed, because if you're resonating, say, identifying or have an intuitive experience with me, unless you verbalize that and talk about what's going on, it doesn't go anywhere. You could acknowledge it or nod your head, but it has to be spoken. And ultimately, the interpersonal is what makes the difference,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
then the person hears the words. And that's what Rogers did so well with his work, too. But he was also criticized vehemently for being just using reflection, just trying to acknowledge the person's feeling. And he had much more to offer than that.
Yeah.
But it was, and sometimes he's stereotyped because of a very limited view. And the model that I kind of developed takes a look at other skills throughout the stages of counseling that, beyond the reflection, ended up with 14 of those, 28 total with the strategic skills. But
Mm-hmm.
that's a whole area of
Yeah.
therapy too.
Yeah, well, with Rogers, I see him as so foundational with the empathic listening, because that is really sort of a core piece. And with that as a foundation, you can just keep building,
Yes.
on it. And it's so, the other thing is it's so practical. It works, it's
It works.
it's not exhortation. Like there's a lot of exhortation and be more empathic. But it's just exhorting, and it goes nowhere. It's like having a real practical kind of a mindset and skill and a way of developing that way of being, or that mindset, is just so foundational. And I think he was doing his group work, so he was kind of trying to make it more of a group process, and was also doing it within mediation conflict, within South Africa and Ireland and so forth. So I think it's a solid foundation that everybody, we just keep building more tools and practices around that.
It is that, and he at the same time, with all his admirable work, I think he struggled with that notion of listening to the client, the internal frame of reference, and having his own point of view, because he had something to say, a lot to
Mm-hmm.
say. I remember seeing him in Boston at a lecture just before, a few years before he died in the early 1980s. And a member of the audience stood up toward the end of the lecture and had a question. What area that you would like to get to have you not done more with in your life in this? And he said empathy. And I remember thinking, that doesn't make sense to me. This guy, he knows, I was a young guy at the time. He knows everything you need to know about that topic. And he himself, I think, would be very pleased to see how empathy has broadened and been examined in various ways and expanded and found its way into various venues and aspects of life. So, because I think that was his nature. He wanted this to be of benefit to people.
Yeah, I was reading, I was a little disappointed there was not more innovation somehow,
Right.
around this. And I'm a little surprised because it seems like the empathy circle, like small groups using mutual empathic listening is kind of like the next logical step. And I'm just wondering, and he went into, the encounter groups, that I think is like, I don't know, it just seems horrible in some sense because people just go at each other. It gets pretty violent. It's pretty rough. And there's no mediating process like mutual empathic listening. And so I was a little surprised because it seems like what we're doing with the empathy circle is just the next logical step. You, instead of just one person doing the listening, you make it mutual. And there's a sense of, I think also a sense of equality within that. It's like people say, oh, they'll say, I'm willing to listen because I want to value equality. You get 5 minutes, I get 5 minutes, we all get 5 minutes. So people sort of appreciate that quality of equality. Yeah.
Right. And then when you mentioned the group movement and the encounter, and there's damage that was done with the
Yeah.
model because there was like very few limits on it in terms of constraints and protecting members. And so, and I think Rogers was appalled with that, as it turned out, in the last few years of his life. Because when you think of your model, the empathy circle, that you are using boundaries. You have a 5-minute period of
Yep.
time. It's very clear what you do. You can have introduce your own topic, and then it's clear what you do after it. And the person's within a 2 hour meeting. So it's organized and it has a structure. And I think you bring in objective empathy by doing that with boundaries, because empathy can be sometimes seen as kind of reckless at times if you're listening to the person and not using some constraints on them. It also can be seen as soft empathy, and I think that's another hindrance, that it's not viewed in a way of simply listening to a person, and it's kind of a mellow way, and I think that is a limited notion of empathy. That's why I think a more broader
Yeah.
framework is needed,
Yeah.
because otherwise it doesn't show the promise and potential that it has.
Yeah, that's why you've done 2 books on empathy. So, I mean, you really value that empathic approach, as I see as actually a key to just better social well-being. If we can nurture this empathic way of being throughout society, I think we just create huge benefits within society. And the model of the empathy circle, we do the circles. There's circles held every week. People come in, and then we do this facilitator training. So we have a 5-week training where people come and learn to facilitate an empathy circle. They learn how to introduce it, and they learn how to deal with challenges. For example, you're bringing new people in, somebody's sharing, somebody, instead of reflecting, they start putting their own stuff in there, and you got to say, oh, just reflect back what you're hearing. When it's your turn, you can say whatever you want, 100% free speech, but just reflect back for now. And so there's all kinds of different blocks, things, they might say, oh, I had that experience, or no, that's stupid, or something like that. We want to hear all that, but first hear them out. So you've got expression met with empathy, and then expression met with empathy.
Yes.
So it's always a combination of sort of free speech and empathy, all the way around. And as that stew kind of goes, I find people just become more open, more trusting. They're able to share more deeply, and a general sense of deeper relational empathy sort of forms out of that. And like what you're bringing in is, yeah, what's going on with the listener, with what are what's happening in their heads, as they're listening, and how do you sort of deal with hold that, because at one level you have to hold that, you have to set it aside for now and just be present until it's your turn to speak, and then you can share
Yes.
all
Yes.
that, and you've got a context for it. Yeah.
You have a context. And by the way, when you speak of that and you talk about your empathy circle, that then is a way of building the trust, because people can trust in the process. They see that this works, and I feel more deeply understood, but I also feel protected.
Mm-hmm.
I think people feel that in that group, that there are boundaries, and it isn't freewheeling. There are restraints on it. But I also feel that you're touching on allowing people to be themselves, to share more broadly than the individual's frame of reference. You seem to go beyond that too. So perhaps my model can kind of augment and build it, particularly from a training perspective,
Yeah.
to honor the things that come your way, those intuitive feelings or imaginative kind of reactions, that there's a place for them. I think they happen anyway.
Yeah, they do. Even in the reflection, these things leak through the reflection. Even if you do a good reflection, the things are coming up, they're subtly brought into the interpersonal, I think, too. You can't kind of like you can't keep it out somehow.
You can't keep it out. So what happens, I think, you have the subjective reactions resonating, but then you have kind of reasoning that filters through your mind. And when you put those together, then you can have the interpersonal, you express it because you've felt it, you've been there, and you've also, from a life experience, a therapeutic experience, you have objective material, and you bring your full person to the encounter with this individual. And then it comes out. It just comes out, because it sounds almost, as we talk, you somehow have to go subjective, interpersonal, objective. I think this naturally occurs.
Mm-hmm.
They summon, they come to an individual, but then it's a time, and you allow it to resonate, allow it to bring through your reasoning process. So it isn't so much, I think of this, I got to switch to this and that.
Yeah.
And then particularly if there's training on the model, then it becomes feels more natural.
Yeah, so there's something happening in someone. You're just trying to divide the different parts that are happening, but in reality, they kind of happen at the same time. They come and they go, and it moves and it flows. And there's sort of an integrated wholeness of things sort of bubbling up. Yeah.
That's right. And it's simply giving a name to them, a way of understanding that these seem to be the components. At least this is a model from that. And I could see that using, because you talked about training with your empathy circle to talk about some of the things we have discussed, to bring together.
Yeah, well, this model, I'm into, let's build a culture of empathy. So I'm sort of into social, political change. I just ran for Congress.
Yes.
And I only got 3% of the vote, but it was an empathy message. I thought, well, here in the San Francisco Bay Area, just to say, hey, we need a culture of empathy. We need to kind of raise it into the political, because what I think it happens is, it's like, therapy, people go to therapy, they get heard and stuff, but then they go back into the world where they're just getting the shit kind of beat out of them, with the cultural stuff that's going on. And that we can shift the culture to make empathy a primary social value. And I've been trying to get, like, the first thing I did running for office is I reached out to the other candidates and did an empathy circle with them. So we were modeling. And so, to have Trump and Biden do an empathy circle, where they listen to each other, I mean, versus a debate, I think would be transformational in the culture, or you get any high profile, because you sort of learn the process by observation. And then, people are doing it in schools, and then they take it to their family. And then, you just kind of, there's a lot of different ways of, training the whole population in these skills, it seems to me.
By the way, when you speak of that, there is literature in the popular press on empathy, as you're talking about it, and you have a particular model. There's academic material on empathy and that. So I think there is a coalescing of ideas around this, and it takes time. But I think there is a movement toward, because when you think of it, how else are we going to get out of some of the mess we're in? If you can understand a person politically, that, or at least honor their view, and then they feel more understood and respected, and a sense of trust that you can do that, then perhaps they may listen to your view, and we can have a kind of going back and forth, a reciprocity. So that is important, the level you are working at, to also take it to the more societal. I'm more of the area of the therapy, but nevertheless, with sharing of ideas,
Yeah,
we can enrich each other's views.
absolutely. Yeah, because it's all overlaps. It's all
Yes.
integrated.
Yeah.
The empathy is like whatever level you're working at, it's kind of the same dynamics. And in terms of the political, we went to in Los Angeles to an impeach Trump rally, back before COVID, and there was several thousand people, marching down the street, and a counter demonstration of, pro-Trump folks. But we brought one person from each side into this empathy tent. We were set up at the City Hall in Los Angeles on the lawn, had our empathy tent.
Right.
And I mediated between the two of them and got the sides to do empathic listening with each other. And we did 6 pairs of people, and each pair ended with hugs between the participants. And on the other side of the street, they were screaming and yelling at each other, throwing epithets and signs, and it was only the police keeping them apart. So, and that, I think I sent you the video of that.
Yes, and I looked at that. That was so good. When you think of it, what an encounter between two people. And they're hugging, and across the street they're going at one another in a belligerent way. And so what's going on here? And so, but keep up your good work. I was so interested in what you're doing and reading about your video work and getting the word out. And I'm doing my thing here. So we'll do that, and many others. We're not alone in this at all.
Yeah.
So there is a movement in that respect.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to promote, as a movement, to think, hey, we need to work together with each other to see how we can bring these different insights. And, and it seems to me even the therapeutic could do more with the mutual empathy as for group work, where you're teaching. So it seems to me that there's a space for that, plus teaching these skills in the schools from the earliest age too.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, that's right.
Well, okay. Well, I should let you go. We've gone on for almost 2.5 hours. I could talk your ear off here.
No, we're good. We talked about just an hour, and it's been an hour and 20 minutes. And so, and I've enjoyed this so much, and hearing about you and you listening to me, and to listen to about my model for that. And you grasped it very well.
Yeah, it's very clear.
I try to be clear, but nevertheless, it says something about your listening ability to be able to pick that up. And then we used our examples and ways too that help clarify. Examples always help with empathy too.
Yeah, well, I'm working on that empathy as a way of being model. I'm developing a course for it. So it's going to be a 6 or 7 week course. online, and so maybe I can talk to you about that sometime when it's farther.
I could just say one thing, and I know we need to wrap up our time together. One way that I've found in introducing empathy to a group is to ask the question, when did you feel deeply understood by a person? Or it could have been that person, anytime you were with them, you felt deeply understood. What is it that went on? You first have to hear what happened, but then what was it that you experienced? And that is I think, a great way to introduce the topic of what empathy is. It doesn't define it in any way, but it gives a sense of a connection to it. And maybe you use that already too.
I usually don't. But what did come up to me is I did a family empathy circle once on a 4th of July, I think it was, with our family members. And we went for like 4.5 hours empathy circle. And the question was, what are early childhood memories that you have? And it just kind of was along the lines, because that's, you've done a lot of work too, just everybody was sharing just like growing up, what were your memories? And it was just really, but we were doing the empathy circle. We were talking about it within the context, the framework of the empathy circle. And it was another thing. It was very moving, people just sharing those early memories.
The early memories, it's something that I've done a lot of work with writing and that and experience with, but the empathy works really well with it. I find it very difficult now to listen to a person's memory from childhood, early childhood, without empathizing. Because for a moment, and memory, they usually take about a minute to share. All the things we were talking about, I think, occur in that moment of the early recollections. If you allow it to resonate and then allow it to kind of build on what you know about from your own experience too.
Yeah, it's very meaningful for people, I think, to share those too. Yeah. Well, great. Well, thanks, Arthur. There'll be a link to, info about you, your LinkedIn and so forth in the chat, and to be continued, I hope. Thanks so much.
That would be good. And we'll stay in touch. Yeah. I appreciate this. It's been a lot of fun. You take care.
Bye.
Take care. Bye now.